Ma ध्यान समाहिता मन निरखे तब कृपा भंजन दुख गंजन करुणा घन कर्म प्राणर्पण जगत तारण प्राणर्पण जगत तारण कृतान कले वाञ्छन काम काञ्चन अति निन्दित इन्द्रिय त्यागे शरहे नार बर त्यागे शरहे नार बर देह पदे निर्भय गत संशय दृढ निश्चय मानस निष्कारण भक्त शरण निष्कारण भक्त शरण त्याजे जाते कुल संपद तब श्री पद भव पुष्पद बारे जाय प्रेमार्पण समुदार शान प्रेमार्पण समुदार शान जग जानो दुख जाय संपद तब श्रीपद भव पुष्पद बारे जाय प्रेमार्पण समदर्शन प्रेमार्पण समदर्शन जग जन दुख जाय नमो नमो प्रभु बाक मनाते तो नमो कमनातीत मन वचन एकाधार, प्रभु मन वचन एकाधार। ज्योतिरज्योति उजल हृदि कंदर, ज्योतिरज्योति उजल हृदि कंदर, तुमि तम भंजनहार, प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार। नमो नमो प्रभु पाकमनातीत, नमो नमो प्रभु पाकमनातीत मन वचन एकाधार, प्रभु मन वचन एकाधार। ज्योतिरज्योति उजल हृदि कंदर, ज्योतिरज्योति उजल हृदि कंदर, तुमि तम भंजनहार, प्रभु तुमि तम भंजनहार। दे 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 लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंशंग मृदंग, दे 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 लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंशंग मृदंग। गाइছে ছন্দ ভকত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার, গাইছে ছন্দ ভকত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার। জয় জয় আরতি তোমার, হর হর আরতি তোমার, শিব শিব আরতি তোমার। খণ্ডন ভব বন্ধন জগবন্ধন, বন্দিত মায়। জয় শ্রী গুরু মহারাজ কি জয়। ओं ह्रीं ऋतं तम चलो गुणाजित गुणेभ्यः, नाक्तां देवां सकरुणां तव पादपद्मं। मोहाङ्कषां बहुकृतां न भजे जतः स्मातमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारि, गच्छन्तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तात्वं। वक्त्रधृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित्, तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृप्तो तृष्णा, रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि रामकृष्णे। मार्तामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्विनाशम्, तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। कृत्यं करोति कलुषां कुहकान्तकारे, स्नान्तां शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ। यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्य, तस्मात् तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गल मङ्गले शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशान शक्तिभूते सनातने गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनार्त परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्थे हरे देवे नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So in this lecture, Maya and the Evolution of the Concept of God, we were at a fairly crucial juncture where Vivekananda is describing these more primitive ideas of religion and how the ancient human being at that stage did not find anything incongruous about certain deeds that were performed by deities, he cites Indra, which today we would find morally and ethically rather abhorrent. Wicked deeds is what he calls them. So to the worshippers of Indra, the ideas of wickedness and evil did not occur, so they did not question them. In other words, the spirit of inquiry had not arisen at that stage. It's very difficult to expect, say, for instance, take even a human child. When does the human child start asking the question, why? Why should I do such and such? Why is such and such thing in this way? It's only at a certain point when this curiosity, wonder, the sense of curiosity, the sense of wonder, at our view of at once while looking at the world, when that particular sentiment gets aroused, when that emotion gets when this quest for knowledge arises in the human heart, the question why arises. It's driven by this love of knowledge, love of truth. Same thing. But that's not something that is necessary for day-to-day survival as a species. The point is that the human brain has not developed in terms of our evolutionary history in order to allow us to make sense of the world around us. The evolutionary scheme is aimed at survival of a species. That is what happens at a very elemental level. Almost, essentially even at a physical level. But then, in the course of evolution, physical evolution, biological evolution, the human brain emerged, outstripping most of the other species in terms of its capacity. We had mentioned before that amongst primates, the size of this the prefrontal cortex is directly proportional to the size of the group with which it identifies. I had mentioned a particular documentary by David Attenborough, Life of Mammals, where while discussing primates, he sort of puts the brains of various primates, the bonobo, the chimpanzee, and the human being, side by side, the gibbon, the baboon, and looks at the size of these, and it's essentially what is the standard size of a tribe or a group in which they wander. And it looks very clear that this larger size of the brain is more or less directly proportional to that. Okay, now this particular thing means that the human or these primates are capable of mapping a certain group of individuals into their own brains, into their own minds, thinking of them as one composite whole. And then, so it becomes a single unit. Usually, we are typically accustomed to thinking of our individual body and mind as a single unit. But evolutionarily, it becomes much easier for these primates to live and hunt and survive together as a group of individuals. So it needs an individual to coordinate with this other members of the group. So it becomes mapped into the brain and treats this group of individuals as one unit. This particular evolutionary mechanism is coded in some aspect of our brains. Fine. What moral, ethical sense does it give rise to subsequently? The notion of altruism, which we typically regard as a moral virtue, is really born here. But when it is abstracted out from its physical ramifications, once this is taken out and regarded as a reality in itself, not for the utilitarian purpose of survival of a species, it becomes altruistic. The altruistic urge in human beings, which causes us, which impels us to serve others as part and parcel of a larger unit to which one individually belongs. So this altruistic urge, also we could call it love or kindness, is one aspect of this evolution. Once this quality starts developing, the earlier gods, lacking in these qualities, once subjected to the test whether they have this higher aspect of human thought and feeling in them, and if they are found lacking, then those gods just need to be revised. So one of the reasons for this enquiry, something Vivekananda will come to pretty soon, is the development of a larger group of people being thought of as one unit. What we today call altruism or love of a larger group or even a nation or of a people, etc., etc. It's kindness which has roots in biological evolution, but then you abstract it out and ask questions of that in itself. This is one particular development in the human psyche that forces us to ask questions of these erstwhile gods. Second, the power of analysis or discrimination, Viveka. We're discussing Vivekananda's lecture, so Viveka must necessarily figure. So this analytical skill, analysis of separating out the dross, these two things happen more or less simultaneously. It's the same part of the brain which indulges in altruistic activity, which indulges in analytical discriminatory work. These two parts, it's this part. I mean, in the human brain, it forms a very sizable part of the brain. Our nearest neighbor is the chimpanzee. It's about 1/5 of what it is in the human brain. So in the human brain, it's maybe about 45%, and in the chimpanzee, it's maybe about 9%. Anyway, these two faculties, one enquiry, the other altruism, necessarily forces us to ask questions of these erstwhile religious dogmas. This is what is the spirit of enquiry. It is not a mere intellectual exercise. At the level of feeling, it is inspired by this development of the altruistic urge, which in turn comes from this development of the human brain, the prefrontal cortex. So let's read through this a little bit, and then we'll come back. With the advance of ethical ideas came the fight. The fight meaning, essentially, are these erstwhile older gods good enough? There arose a certain sense in man, called in different languages and nations by different names. Call it the voice of God, or the result of past education, or whatever else you like. It's what exact terminology you use to describe this awakening is not important. I've tried to describe it in biological terms here. Essentially, the development of two things. One, the analytical ability. Two, the urge for altruism. And it's curious, I'll just mention this as an aside, that two of the yogas, there are these 4 yogas, right? We are studying Jnana Yoga, there's Bhakti Yoga, and there is Karma Yoga, and there's meditation. So very directly, what is the direct thing that on a day-to-day basis that Karma Yoga does? It's basically altruism, service of a larger number of people regarding it as one's own. What does it impinge on? What does it draw from? It essentially draws from this altruistic instinct. So part of the evolved forebrain. Jnana Yoga, what does it depend on? It depends on the analytical skills, Viveka. So at least 2 of the yogas more or less directly draw from these 2 aspects, namely 1, the altruistic urge, 2, the spirit of enquiry or analysis. So this is what we have described it. Vivekananda uses the same thing, but in somewhat, not in biological terms, but essentially result of past education or the voice of God. That's what he calls it. The effect was this, that it had a checking power upon the natural impulses of man. A checking power upon the natural impulses, by which one means basically the animal impulses, which promotes our instinct to survive both individually and as a species. There is one impulse in our minds which says, do. Behind it rises another voice which says, do not. There is one set of ideas in our mind which is always struggling to get outside through the channels of the senses, and behind that, although it may be thin and weak, there is an infinitely small voice which says, do not go outside. The 2 beautiful Sanskrit words for these phenomena are pravritti and nivritti, circling forward and circling inward. It is the circling forward which usually governs our actions. And then he underscores exactly what constitutes the religious urge. Religion begins with this circling inward. Religion begins with this do not. Spirituality begins with this do not. When the do not is not there, religion has not begun. So the use of religion for violence, for killing, etc., is not religion in these words. It's politics, it's animal behavior, it's violence. It has nothing to do with religion. However, unless people conflate and confuse these two aspects of our being, then the politics and the power, the urge for ruling others, the urge for self-protection, physical, is not going to survive unless it hijacks the higher brain functions. So when you see people trying to express viciousness or violence or hatred or anger and try to give a religious flavor, a coloring to this, what they are doing is really a dishonest enterprise. At least in these terms, if we basically ask them what exactly do they mean by religion, it is largely unexamined. It is based on these tribal instincts, which in turn go back to our evolution as animals, as the urge to survive both as individuals and as a species. It does not have anything to do with our higher brain functions of altruism and analysis. And this do not came causing men's ideas to grow despite the fighting gods which they had worshipped. So this particular aspect of our being slowly trumps, slowly overrides the earlier instincts for violence and fighting, which were epitomized in the earlier fighting gods. And now he comes to this notion of altruism and he expresses it in a slightly different language. A little love awoke in the hearts of mankind. It was very small indeed, and even now it is not much greater, which is why we see all this violence in the name of religion all around. Yeah? It was at first confined to a tribe, embracing perhaps members of the same tribe. These gods loved their tribes, and each god was a tribal god and the protector of that tribe. And sometimes the members of a tribe would think of themselves as the descendants of their god, just as the clans in different nations think that they are the common descendants of the man who was the founder of that clan. So herein lies the crucial thing. What he is basically delineating is that this idea of violence, of fights between tribes, which really goes back to our animal beginnings, between chimpanzees which stick together, between other primates that stick together, between monkeys that stick together, between tribes of ancient Homo sapiens that stick together. It is there that this violence needs to be hunted. It's there that the earlier gods who fought amongst each other and their worship, etc., these are born out of these tribal ideas, which are basically biological in origin. Biological, by which I really mean the lesser brain, the lesser part of our organization, which essentially groups a bunch of people together, and then a group of people basically take that conglomerate and assign to that one deity. And then there's another group of people, and they group together and assign themselves to another deity. And then these two deities give them names X, Y, doesn't matter what it is. These are going to be fighting each other. What is really happening is that this X and Y, the tribal god 1 and the tribal god 2, are just two stories. Two stories that have been concocted by two groups of individuals and then passed on, generation after generation. And what happens is that it defines a way of how one group of people is going to survive at the cost of perhaps another. This is really at the heart of it. There is no reason to glorify this because it's at the base of it an instinct which we share with all our primate neighbors, with dogs, with cats, with chimpanzees. There's nothing particularly noble about this, which is why Vivekananda refuses to call this something that has anything to do with religion. So this is just something that's an animal urge conglomerated. Yeah? And if one calls it religion, one is playing politics, but there is no religion content in any of this. Okay. So we see basically what is this a result of then? Essentially taking these two gold standards, one, altruism, two, analysis, and subjecting our pre-existing tribal notions, pre-existing notions of groups of people, etc., to this test. To the test of rational inquiry on the one hand and altruism on the other. Now, once we accept these two higher aspects of our being as the root of the core religious instinct, then it becomes something much more general and not necessarily confined to the domains of what we refer to as organized religions today. What would be the test of a person's, what would be the test of in terms of a person's behavior of how these aspects contribute? See, the thing is, if these higher convictions, namely the altruistic conviction or a conviction in rational analysis to get at the truth, if these were too weak, then they would not be reflected in our behavior. Those would just be some intellectual or at best some kind of an emotional baggage we carry around with ourselves without translating any of it into practice. So, suppose some Indra talks high philosophy, but then goes and performs all kinds of wicked deeds. In today's language, we just probably call him a fraud, right? Person who cannot be honest about the convictions or the ideas that he professes. So that needs to be tested in terms of actions. How do those ideas translate into practice? And as I said just some time back, these ideas, once you sort of remove them from this embedding of group psychology or tribal religions or organized religions, these become things which define us as human beings. Certain higher brain functions, namely altruism and clear analysis. Fine. What is the test? What is the practical test? And essentially the test becomes how much of the comforts or the wants or the desires of this tribal or lower nature, are we willing to give up for the sake of conviction in these higher aspects of our own being? These higher aspects, which we've summarized these as altruism and analysis, in some sense, that's what is called the higher aspect. Let's sort of give them the terminology that Vivekananda uses in another place. It's the higher aspect of our being. And the lower aspect, the animal aspect, is what gives rise to violence and anger and efforts at preserving both oneself and propagation of ourselves as a species. Now, there is now a conflict between two aspects of our own personality. All of us, by dint of being human beings, have both these aspects. Question: what really is the test of, let's say, development? Let's say spiritual development. It's essentially how much this higher has conquered the lower. What does that mean? It means the empirical external test for it is very simple. In case there is a choice in front of an individual, on the one hand, there is security measured by the first two terms. The second, this more abstract, higher aspects of our being, which somehow are non-physical in nature. They are more universal in nature. Which one does that person choose? It's there in the Kathopanishad. Shreyascha preyascha manushyameta tau avidhyayan vivinakti dhira. Vivinakti means separates these two out through Vishleshan, analysis. Vivinakti dhira. And the person, it's the dhira comes from this word called dhi. Dhi means this buddhi, this lighted up intelligence or intellect, which analyzes and chooses. And the shreya, that which is better, not favorable. Preya is favorable or pleasant. Shreya is that which is better. This is exactly where our values are based. The notion of ethics, notion of good and bad, it's really based on exactly this discrimination, this analysis. Which one does one choose? When there is a choice between security of the animal life, let's say, in a very general sense, security of the physical life, and holding on to some higher value, which is more universal, not limited to one's identity as an individual embodied being. Which one does one choose? Which one is chosen? This choice decides for us what exactly our evolution is going to be towards. And as I said, now, once you have abstracted it out from the background in which these are usually discussed in the context of various organized religions, now they have become part and parcel of all human beings. And this fight is there in all of us. The evolution in these terms, in terms of what used to be called religious and nowadays often called spiritual evolution, is really which do you choose over which? Do you choose the higher over the lower when a choice presents to you? Well, then you are veering towards the so-called spiritual aspect. If you veer towards the physical survival, the physical entity, then you are veering towards the non-physical aspect. There is no clear-cut solution. It's only a person to whom the physical being has no value who can consistently choose the first one. And for somebody to whom this higher thing has no value, consistently chooses the animal. These are two extremes. But these choices present themselves to us at every instant. We have a little bit of time left, and I'd like to mention a few examples of choices people have made over various times, which somehow exemplify what exactly the first choice entails. Two of our presidents, I just mentioned two incidents from the lives of two of our presidents. The 12th president of our order, Swami Bhuteshananda, was doing a relief activity around Shillong at a certain point of time. And cholera had broken out. Patients would be drawn there, would come along, and very often they would come along in trucks, almost like cattle. They had some limited medication which they would give it to them, and many of them would die in the relief camp. This went on for about a month. Because cholera is very contagious. So first, what needs to be done in order to do some effective relief activity at this stage is conquer the fear of one's own mortality. One day, he says, about 900 people were brought in various trucks, cholera patients. All of them died. Essentially, seeing in front of you the mortality of human beings, and the immediate thing meaning that this particular body is also going to die exactly like this, and it is being subjected to this constant barrage of the cholera virus. But in order to perform this relief activity, what does one have to do? One has to hold this altruistic aspect as something that is stronger than the fear that comes from this body going to die and all these bodies around us dying. Holding on to that is a vanquishing of this baser instinct by the higher instinct, which is more universal. One has, in a very clear-headed sense, one has to accept the fact that one could possibly die in the process. However, this more universal altruistic aspect of us, not limited to the sense of I being this body, is something that survives. Is something. So the choice one has to make is, what does one stand for? Does one stand for the mortality of the body? Or does one stand for this particular aspect of our being, which is universal, which identifies with a larger group of people and is going to survive the death of even one's own body? This is the discrimination, the analysis, the choice, and the consequent choice in favor of altruism that this person has to make. Well, in that particular case, he survived and then went on much later to become one of the presidents of our order. The 13th president of our order, Swami Ranganathananda, was in Rangoon during the Second World War when it broke out. And the Japanese were bombing the center there had hospitals, and they were bombing, and I think certain hospitals it was not possible to maintain it. So they decided to come back to India. Apparently, he was offered a passage which would have been relatively safe and fast. The choice the person makes is no, other people are walking. The ordinary people who are subjected to the same violence in the form of war are walking through forests, and they were going to enter India through the northeast. The choice then is I am not going to take any special provisions for myself, and I walk with them. This is the choice that Swami Ranganatha made. In other words, mortality, accepting it, was a possibility. In fact, at some point during that journey, he felt that, there were people dying on the way. And at some point, he felt he was also going to get finished. Essentially, there was hardly any strength left. When he reached finally India, it was less than 40 kgs. Tall man, around 6 feet. Less than 40 kgs, 38 or 39 kgs weight. But the fact, so this conviction that I am not different from these ordinary people around oneself is an aspect of precisely this altruistic urge, which disallows one to differentiate from other people. I am the same as they are. Both these examples are examples of people who have demonstrated in these two specific events the capacity for the higher aspect of our being to conquer the physical aspect of our being, even mortality. I'll conclude with a certain event from Gandhi's life, which I've been reading relatively recently. Many of you probably know of this. During the 46 riots in Noakhali, in present Bangladesh, then East Bengal, or then Bengal, about 5,000 people were killed, and maybe 4 times that number were heavily wounded. It was burning. Yeah? This man went for about a month. No protection, no safeguards, no armed guards, nothing. By walking through those villages to make sure of both communities, Hindus and Muslims, people had been killed and there was still violence in the air. And there were, even during that 1 month, there were sporadic acts of violence. What happened during that particular month is that the temperature of the place came down. Why? One individual's convictions in this power of non-violence overrides this tribal instinct of animal violence. These are all instances where these higher human thoughts, feelings, activities can override these instincts of mortality. And it is in these events, these aspects of individual life stories, that we find what we call, as a species, greatness. Greatness, finally, in anything, really boils down to a battle between the mortal aspect and the more universal aspect, in which this universal aspect becomes something more. Okay? So we'll stop. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.